Welcome back to another session of Church Administration 202. Today we're going to talk about the funeral ministry. It is impossible to overemphasize the funeral's importance because the grief associated with funerals can be a very painful event, but if properly done, they can be healing, restorative, victorious, and even worshipful. Funeral rituals are universal according to anthropologists. This means that they perform for all societies some vital function in the social life. We will identify the basic purposes or the functions of the funeral in today's presentation. What will you learn today? You will learn the importance of a funeral. You will learn the 7 purposes of a funeral. You'll learn to use terminology that affirms the reality of death, and then some answers to common questions that we'll raise, such as, should a child attend a funeral service? And what about revisiting the grave after the service? Conducting your funeral service for individuals is a time that the minister needs to be at his best. It's a time that we love people and give them a safe environment to express their grief. It's a time to allow the community of faith to come around these individuals to help them. Now, I want to encourage you to be an advocate for every person being given a proper funeral and a proper burial. I did a funeral service for an individual on one occasion, and it was a very sad time. It was an instance where only myself and 3 employees of the funeral home were present. The person had no relatives, had no group of people around him to help him move through to this point of death. And so there was no one to say, we love you, we appreciate you. But we went on with the funeral service. That might surprise you, but we did the funeral service as if there were 500 people in attendance. A funeral director told me the story of a person who'd been cremated and the family refused to have a service of any kind. They did not give directions regarding what to do with the disposition of the remains, so the funeral home director just stored the ashes in the funeral home for a few days. The family came back later, expressing great grief because they had not had a service for their loved one. The funeral director was able to smile and say, I still have the remains here, and we can go ahead with a memorial service if you like. You see, their grief had not been affirmed in public, which left them no support system to help. They weren't able to be given the encouragement that they need and to help them to deal with the adjustment. The funeral gives some closure to a family, and so I would argue that you should always encourage your families to have some kind of service. Now, why do we go to a funeral or to a memorial service? That's a natural question, and we want to answer those. Because you see, when someone dies, it's customary to have a funeral service. And that is true, and that is an answer to the question, why do we go? But it goes much deeper than that. Just because it's customary, it's not the best answer to give. Why has society developed and maintained this practice? Well, here are the purposes of a funeral. A funeral makes possible the expression of grief. Grief is a normal, necessary reaction to the loss of someone. It does not find expression in normal channels sometimes. And when it is not expressed at a funeral service or in a memorial service or at visitation, it can affect the bereaved in many ways. For some, it affects them for a lifetime. The funeral is society's therapeutic mechanism for bereavement. It encourages the expression of grief. The minister can play a valuable role in this process. Second, it's a time for the deceased person to be honored at the funeral service. I need to commemorate this event, is what we're saying when we show up at the funeral home. I need to be with other people. It can be a sad time, but I truly am glad to be here. At a funeral service, we pay our last respects to the deceased person. We say by our very presence that this person was significant in my life. I simply must take note of what happened. I want and need to commemorate this event. That is the event of the death of a friend. The period of lying in state in the funeral home and the burial ritual all compose a set of public events that focus upon the deceased. Just as they also affect the bereaved, these are events that affirm the significance of the dead person. They also constitute the first step in restructuring the social world from which the deceased is absent. All of this requires that this final chapter be a fitting one for the life of the person who died. There is value in visitation as well. It's a public event during the period of lying in state when people assemble and interact with the survivors. 2 points should be remembered. The character of the individual should be reflected in this observance, and there should be many opportunities for people to express themselves about the deceased. I challenge you to tailor the funeral service to the person who died. Lengthy, overstated, insincere outpourings of praise are repugnant. The reason for the funeral is, however, to honor the person who has died. It's perfectly fine to put together a eulogy, and a pastor may be expected to do this. Be sure, however, that you craft the eulogy with care. The funeral will only effectively fulfill its function if the minister is on the top of his game. Now, number 3, it's a time to comfort the bereaved or provide a framework of support and relationships that can go on. The deceased family urgently needs the assurance that friends care. The funeral service is one way to meet this need. It is one way for us to say, I want to be with you. I want to share your grief. I want to offer my love and pledge my continuing concern. Death is a time when people circle the wagons in defense against the ancient foe, mortality. The funeral draws people together, the family, the friends, the community, in expression of unity and care. A supportive network is critically important in dealing with grief. During the funeral and afterwards, the minister can make significant contributions to accomplish this purpose successfully. The minister must know that he is not the entire social network, however. Others may be even more helpful, at least at certain points. Old, deeply established ties of friendship and kinship may touch the mourner in a way that the minister never could. Number 4, the purpose of the funeral is to celebrate God's sovereignty over life and death. We worship God together at a Christian funeral. We are grateful that although we do not know what the future holds, we do know who holds the future. So, in a profound sense, we rejoice, knowing, as Paul said, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. Now on this slide, we continue the presentation about the purposes of the funeral service. First purpose we examined was to have the opportunity of expressing grief, to honor the deceased, to comfort the bereaved, to celebrate God's sovereignty. And now we come to number 5. It is to allow ourselves to offer God all our honest feelings. Nobody is perfect, and human relationships are seldom, if ever, without blemish. Therefore, at death, there is an opportunity for us to come before the Lord and offer Him our honest feelings. These feelings will ordinarily be a mix of emotions. Guilt, regret, all of these can be a part of the mix. We sometimes say, if only I had said or done this or that. Or if I had engaged in these words of affirmation with the deceased person before they died, my life would be much better. We can use this time to give ourselves an opportunity to think about our true feelings. And then number 6, it's to remind ourselves of a continuing responsibility. While waiting for the service to begin, we should spend a few minutes pondering such questions as, how can I give practical proof of my love and concern next week, next month, or next year? Regrettably, many will have forgotten the deceased's family after the funeral service. Grief is not healed in an instant. If the process is to continue, some of us must go on caring for a long time. Number 7 is to recognize our mortality and reinforce the reality of death. Individual and social adjustment to death requires that the bereaved family, friends, and community accept the reality of death itself. There is a tendency toward denial as a mechanism to avoid or postpone the pain of grief. The funeral forces attention upon public acknowledgement of death. The minister can do several things that help the bereaved come to grips with the reality of death. Now, on this slide, I want to share some observations that I hope will be helpful for you. These observations are from my experience as a minister for many, many years. One of the things I would encourage you to do is not assume that a grieving funeral is unchristian. The Apostle Paul instructed the Thessalonians about the resurrection in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 through 18, and he said that you may not grieve as others who do not have hope. He doesn't say that we should not grieve at all, but that we should not grieve as those who do not have hope. The resurrection indeed assures the benefit that the loss of a loved one is temporary, not permanent. However, present loss brings great pain. It's a natural part of the human condition for which Christ was deeply sympathetic. He said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Number 2, in the funeral service, I encourage you to always use the deceased person's name. A depersonalized funeral service suggests that the minister did not know the deceased, or that he is relying on a canned ceremony for the service. If the funeral does not relate specifically to the deceased, it will not speak to the people who are in attendance. Number 3, involve others in the service. The more a funeral service is a worship service with full congregational participation, the more positive the impact will be. Number 4, what about children? Should children go to the funeral service or visitation? Well, a carefully guided visit for children to the funeral home in a small group of family or other trusted adults should be encouraged if, and only if, the child wants to make that trip. Make it a time for honest answers and deeply shared grief. A funeral causes us to reflect. We reflect on how fragile life is and the quality and the direction of our own lives. A funeral should be a time that stimulates a little soul searching. What would I like people to say about me when I finish my course here on the earth? Then, number 5, avoid euphemisms for death. Use the terminology that affirms the reality of death. I try to avoid such phrases as, "he passed away," or "he's no longer with us." I simply use the word death. I encourage you to use simple words when you're talking about death and when you're communicating it to a child or to anyone else for that matter. And then number 6, what about visiting the graveside? Well, there's something particularly final about the grave. It bears mute witness that physical death is permanent. Many families customarily return with an inner circle of friends to the graveside after the grave has been closed and funeral arrangements have been placed around the grave. This is typically a time of grief reflecting. It gives the individual an opportunity to again deal with the finality of death. Some people return to the gravesite over and over and over again as a way of respecting the deceased individual and also as a way of dealing with their own emotions. Well, this brings us to the close of this particular presentation. I have a question. What additional purposes for a funeral would you include in a lecture like the one that you have just listened to? I'd really be interested to know. And in fact, a question will be on this week's interactive activity that will ask you that question. What additional purposes do you see that should have been mentioned in this lecture? This is the end of the presentation. May God bless you richly and in every way.